Good day. This is our video lecture notes from Political Science on political parties. So I'll hope not to bore you too much. We'll get through this and then bring your questions to class and I'll answer them there. So every 2 years, usually starting in early fall, the media concentrate on the state of the political parties. For example, during most of the 2008 election, the media offered continuous commentaries on the relative fortunes of Democrats and Republicans. Until the Democratic nominee was known, the media focused intensively on what impact the heated race between Illinois Senator Barack Obama and New York Senator Hillary Clinton might have on Democrats and the Democratic Party. As the elections drew near, the polls also concentrated on discovering which political party each potential voter believed that he or she belonged to. Prior to an election, a typical pollster or a typical poll will ask the following question: do you consider yourself to be a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? In recent years, the responses have shown that Americans divide fairly evenly among three choices, with about a third describing themselves as independent. Of course, independents are not represented that way in Congress. For congressional purposes, they align themselves with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. In fact, almost half of all independents in 2000 leaned toward the Democratic Party, and almost 1/3 lean toward the Republican Party. After the elections are over, the media will publish the election results. Among other things, Americans learn which party controls the presidency and how many Democrats and Republicans will be sitting in the House of Representatives and the Senate when the new Congress convenes. Now notice at the beginning, when discussing party membership, I put the word, or I try to state the word belonged as sort of a quote. Now I did this because hardly anyone actually belongs to a political party in the sense of being a card-carrying member. To become a member of a political party, you don't have to pay dues, you don't pass a test, or you swear an oath of allegiance. Therefore, at this point, I have to ask you an obvious question. What does it take to be a member of a political party? What is a political party then? A political party might be formally defined as a group of political activists who organize to win elections, to operate the government, and determine public policy. This definition explains the difference between an interest group and a political party. Interest groups do not want to operate the government, and they do not put forth political candidates even though they support candidates who will promote their interests if elected or re-elected. Now, another important distinction is that interest groups tend to sharpen issues, whereas American political parties sometimes hone their issue positions to attract a broader range of voters. Now, political parties differ from factions, which are smaller groups that are trying to obtain power or benefits. Factions generally precede the formation of political parties in American history, and the term is used to refer to groups within parties and follow a particular leader or share a regional identification or an ideological viewpoint. For example, until fairly recently, the Democratic Party was seen as containing a southern faction that was much more conservative than the rest of the party. Factions are some group within a party that may try to capture a nomination or get a position adopted by the party in their platform. A key difference between a faction and a party is that the faction do not have a permanent organization, whereas political parties do. Political parties in the United States are engaged in a wide variety of activities, many of which I will discuss in this unit. Through these activities, parties perform a number of functions for the political system. And these functions include the following. They recruit candidates for public office. Because it's the goal of the party to gain control of government, they must work to recruit candidates for all elective offices. Although this means recruiting candidates to run against powerful incumbents. If parties did not search out and encourage political hopefuls, far more offices would go uncontested, and voters would have much more limited choices. Political parties organize and they run elections. Now, although elections are a governmental activity, political parties are the ones that are actually organizing the voter registration drives. They recruit volunteers to work at the polls. They provide much of the campaign activity to stimulate interest in the election. And they work to increase voter participation. Political parties present alternative policies and procedures to the electorate. In contrast to a faction, which is often centered on an individual politician or a region, parties are focused on a set of political positions. The Democrats or Republicans in Congress vote together, and they do so because they represent a constituency that have similar expectations and demands. Political parties accept responsibility for operating the government. When a party elects the president or a governor or members of a legislature, it accepts that responsibility for running the government until the next set of elections. This includes stacking the executive branch with loyal party supporters and developing linkages among the elected officials to gain support for policies and their implementation. And political parties do act as the organized opposition to the party in power. They are the out party, or the one that doesn't control government, and they are expected to articulate their own policies and oppose the winning party when appropriate. But organizing the opposition to the party, they force the debate on policy alternatives. They hold the party in power accountable. Now, the major functions of American political parties are carried out by a small, relatively loose-knit nucleus of party activists. This arrangement is quite different from the more highly structured mass membership party organization that's fairly typical of most European parties. American parties concentrate on winning elections rather than on signing up large numbers of deeply committed, dues-paying members who believe passionately in the party's program. So let's take a look at where political parties came from in the United States and kind of try to tie that into your U.S. history. Although it's difficult to imagine a political system in the United States with 4, 5, 6, or 7 major political parties, other democratic nations have 3-party, 4-party, or even 10-party systems. In some European nations, parties are clearly tied to an ideological position. Parties represent a Marxist, a socialist, a liberal, a conservative, or ultra-conservative positions as they appear on the political spectrum. Some nations have political parties representing regions of a nation that have separate cultural identities, such as the French-speaking and Flemish-speaking areas of Belgium. Some parties are rooted in religious differences. Parties also insist that parties that represent economic interests, such as agricultural or maritime or industrial interests, exist. Still other parties, such as monarchist parties, speak for alternative political systems. Now, the United States has a 2-party system, and that system has been around since 1800. The function and character of the political parties, as well as the emergence of the 2-party system itself, has much to do with the unique historical forces that have been operating on this country beginning when it became an independent nation. Indeed, James Madison linked the emergence of political parties to the form of government that was created by the Constitution. Now, generally, we can divide the evolution of the nation's political parties into 7 different periods. The first is the period of parties from 1789 to 1816. The second is an era of one-party rule from 1816 to 1828. The third is a period from Andrew Jackson's presidency to just before the Civil War, from 1828 to 1856. The fourth is the Civil War and post-Civil War period from 1856 to 1896. The fifth is what we would consider the Republican ascendancy and the Progressive era from 1896 to 1932. The sixth is the New Deal and what we would consider an era of Democrats from 1932 to 1968. And the seventh would be a modern period from 1968 to today. Now let's look at this first division. The first partisan division in the United States occurred before the adoption of the Constitution. Federalists, who were those people who pushed for the adoption of the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, those who pushed against ratification, made up this division. In September 1796, George Washington, who had served as president for almost 2 full terms, decided not to run again, probably his greatest legacy. In his farewell address, he made a somber assessment of the nation's future. Washington felt that the country might be destroyed by the baneful and harmful facts of the spirit of party. He viewed political parties as a threat to both the national unity and the concept of popular government. Now, early in his career, Thomas Jefferson didn't want political parties either. In 1789, he stated, quote, "If I could not go to heaven, but with the party, I would not go there at all," end quote. Nevertheless, in the years after the ratification of the Constitution, Americans came to realize that something more permanent than a faction would be necessary to identify candidates and represent political differences among the people. The result was 2 different political parties. One party was the Federalist Party, which included John Adams, the second president of the United States. The Federalists represented commercial interests such as merchants and large planners. They supported a strong national government, and we would find Federalists more on the coastal regions, the trading areas of the United States. Thomas Jefferson led the other party, which came to be known as the Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans. These were the Anti-Federalists, but nobody wanted to be called anti, so they took the name Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, these Republicans should not be confused with the later Republicans of Abraham Lincoln, or the Republicans of today. Jeffersonian Republicans represented artisans and farmers. They strongly supported states' rights. In 1800, when Jefferson defeated Adams in the presidential contest, one of the world's first peaceful transfers from one political party to another was achieved. Now, from 1800 to 1820, a majority of U.S. voters regularly elected these Jeffersonian Republicans to the presidency and to Congress. And by 1816, the Federalist Party had virtually collapsed to the point that 2-party competition really didn't exist anymore. Although during elections, Republicans that opposed the Federalist call for a stronger, more active government, they undertook such active government policies such as acquiring Louisiana Territory and Florida and establishing a national bank. So in a sense, they did take on some of the Federalist sense, some of the policies that they would have advocated. Because there was no real political opposition to the Republicans, and thus very little political debate, the administration of James Monroe came to be known as the era of good feelings. Since political competition now, up to a place among individual Republican aspirants, this era, we could also call it the era of personal politics. But this era didn't last forever. Organized party politics, or 2-party politics, is going to return in 1824. With the election of John Quincy Adams as president, the Republican Party, these Jeffersonian Republicans, split into 2. The followers of Adams call themselves National Republicans. The followers of Andrew Jackson, who defeated Adams in 1828, form this new Democratic Party. Later, the National Republicans take the name Whig Party, which had been in the traditional name for British liberals. The Whigs stood for, among other things, federal spending on internal improvements, such as roads. The Democratic Party opposed this policy. Democrats, who were the stronger of the two parties, favored personal liberty and the opportunity for the common man. This was understood implicitly that the common man was actually a white man hostility toward African Americans, and this was an important force that held the disparate, different democratic groups together. This was the party of slavery. Now, Democratic success was linked to their superior efforts to involve common citizens in the political process. Mass participation in politics and elections was a new phenomenon in the 1820s, as political parties began to appeal to popular enthusiasm and themes. Political parties adopted the techniques of mass campaigns, including rallies and parades. Lavishing food and drink on voters at polling places became very common in this period. Perhaps the greatest importance, however, was the push to cultivate a party identity and loyalty. In large part, the spirit that motivated this new mass politics was democratic pride and participation. Making citizens feel as they were part of the political process, parties hoped to win their lasting party support at the ballot box. Now, in the 1850s, hostility between the North and the South over the issue of slavery divided both parties. The Whig parties were the first to go. They split in two. The Whigs had been the party of the active federal government, but Southerners came to believe that government strong enough to build roads is governing strong enough to take your slaves. So the Southern Whigs, therefore, ceased to exist as an organized party by the 1850s. In 1854, Northern Whigs united with anti-slavery Democrats and members of the radical anti-slavery Free Soil Party, and they founded the modern Republican Party. After the Civil War, the Democratic Party was able to heal its divisions. Southern resentment of the Republicans' role in defeating the South and fears that the federal government would intervene on behalf of African Americans ensured that the Democrats would dominate the white South for the next century. Northern Democrats feared a strong government for many other reasons. Republicans thought that the government should promote business and economic growth, but many Republicans also wanted to use the government to impose evangelical, Protestant moral values on society. Democrats opposed what they saw as culturally coercive measures. Many Republicans wanted to limit or even prohibit the sale of alcohol. They favored the establishment of public schools when the curriculum was of a Protestant nature. As a result, Catholics were strongly Democratic. In 1884, Protestant minister Samuel Burchard described the Democrats as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. This remark was so offensive to Catholics and Republican presidential candidate James Blaine later claimed that it cost him the White House in 1884. Now, in this period of the late 19th century, late 1880s, the parties were pretty evenly matched in strength. The abolition of the 3/5 rule, which we talk about in the creation of the Constitution, which counted every 5 slaves as 3 free persons, meant that African Americans would be counted fully when House seats were allocated to the South. The Republicans, therefore, had to carry almost every single northern state to win, and therefore this wasn't always possible. In the 1890s, however, the Republicans did gain a decisive edge. In that decade, the populist movement emerged in the West and in the South to champion the interests of small farmers. Now, these farmers were often heavily in debt. Populists supported inflation, which benefited debtors by reducing the real value of their outstanding debts. In 1896, when William Jennings Bryan became the Democratic candidate for president, the Democrats embraced this idea of populism. But as it turned out, few Western farmers were actually drawn to the Democrats. by this were dramatically outnumbered by the number of urban working class voters who believed that inflation was going to reduce their purchasing power of their paychecks. And therefore, all of those people became Republicans. So William McKinley, the Republican candidate in 1896, was elected with a solid majority of the votes. And this pattern of regional support of Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South and populism in the West persisted for the next 40 years. From 1896 to 1932, the Republicans were successful at presenting themselves as the party that knew how to manage the economy. So in the early 1900s, the spirit of political reform both rose in both major parties. Called progressivism, this spirit was compounded of a fear of a growing power of large corporations and to believe that honest, impartial government could regulate the economy effectively. In 1912, the Republican Party temporarily split when former President Theodore Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency by a third-party progressive, or what was known as the Bull Moose ticket. The Republican split then permitted the election of Woodrow Wilson, a minority Democratic candidate, along with the Democratic Congress. Like Roosevelt, Wilson considered himself a progressive, although he and Roosevelt didn't agree with what progressivism really meant or how it ought to be implemented. Wilson's progressivism marked the beginning of a radical change in Democratic policies. Dating back to its very beginning, the Democratic Party had been the party of limited government. But under Wilson, the Democrats became for the first time at least as receptive as Republicans to using the government in the economy. Wilson's progressivism didn't extend to race relations, though. For African Americans, the Wilson administration was something of a disaster, and we'll look at that in your civil rights section. In recent years, many Democrats have reviewed and have resurrected this term progressive to describe their politics and don't call themselves liberals anymore. This Republican ascendancy resumed once Wilson left office in 1920, but it ended with the election of 1932 in the depths of the Great Depression. Republican Herbert Hoover was president when that depression began in 1929. Although Hoover took some measures to fight the Depression, they fell far short of what the public demanded. Significantly, Hoover opposed federal relief for the unemployed and the destitute, and in 1932, Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected president by an overwhelming margin. The Great Depression shattered the working class belief in this Republican economic competence. So under Roosevelt, Democrats began to make major interventions in the economy in an attempt to combat the Depression and to relieve the suffering of the unemployed. Roosevelt's New Deal relief programs were open to all citizens, both black and white. And as a result, African Americans began to support the Democratic Party in large numbers, a development that would have stunned an American politician of the 1800s if we could snap our fingers and make them appear. Roosevelt's political coalition was broad enough to establish the Democrats as the new majority party in place of the Republicans. In the 1950s, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, the leading U.S. general during World War II, served 2 terms as president. But otherwise, with minor interruptions, the Democratic ascendancy lasted until 1968. Now, this New Deal coalition managed the unlikely feat of including both African Americans and whites who were hostile to the African American advancement. And this is something that students really grapple with, is the best way for me to put it. This is a balancing act that really is going to come to an end in the 1960s, a decade that's been really marked by the civil rights movement, by several years of race riots in major cities, and by increasingly heated protests against the Vietnam War. For many economically liberal, socially conservative voters, especially in the South, social issues have become more important than economic ones. And these individuals left the Democratic Party. These voters outnumber the new voters who joined the Democratic Party. Newly enfranchised African Americans and former liberal Republicans in New England and in the upper Midwest. So as a result, after 1968, the nation was almost evenly divided in political parties. We've gotten back to this point of the parties were fairly balanced. In presidential elections, Republicans had more success than Democrats. Until 1994, Congress was mainly Democratic, but official party labels are really misleading. Some of those Democrats were Southern conservatives who normally voted with Republicans on issues. And as these conservative Democrats retired, they were largely replaced by Republicans. In the 4 years between the elections of 1968 and 2008, the overall lead, the overall 10 years where one of the two major parties controlled the presidency, the House of Representatives and the Senate, there was only, let me kind of get into it. Democrats controlled all three of those institutions during the presidency of Jimmy Carter and during the first 2 years of the presidency of Bill Clinton. That was it. So for a total of 6 years. Republicans controlled all three institutions during the 3rd through the 6th years of George W. Bush's presidency. Before the 1992 elections, the electorate seems to prefer in most circumstances to match a Republican president with a Democratic Congress. But under Bill Clinton, that state of affairs was reversed, with a Democratic president facing a Republican Congress. The pattern of the Republican Congress and a Democratic president would have continued after the elections of 2000 if Democratic presidential candidate Al Gore had prevailed. Gore won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College by a very narrow margin. The extreme closeness of that vote in the Electoral College led the press to repeatedly publish a state map after the results, and that map's actually in your book. Commentators discussed at length the supposed differences between Republican red states and Democratic blue states. In the presidential elections of 2004, George W. Bush won the popular vote by a margin of more than 3 million votes over Democratic John Kerry. Yet only 3 states changed hands. Bush picked up Iowa and New Mexico, which had voted Democratic in 2000, but he lost New Hampshire. Clearly, the political parties continued to be closely matched. Now, an interesting characteristic of the 2000 and 2004 red state, blue state maps is that they are almost exact reversals of the map showing the presidential elections of 1896, which established the Republican ascendancy that lasted until the Great Depression. Now, except for the state of Washington, every single state that supported Democrat Williams Jennings Bryan in 1896 supported George W. Bush in 2002 and 2004. This reversal parallels the transformation of the Democratic Party from an anti-civil rights party to a pro-civil rights party, and from a party that supported limited government in the past to a party that favors positive government action. So what's happened more recently? Well, by 2006, the Republicans were in trouble. Violence in Iraq, including attacks on American soldiers, and the low-level civil war between Sunni and Shiite communities had continued. Ever larger numbers of voters came to believe that the U.S. occupation in Iraq had been a mistake and that American forces should be withdrawn quickly. Apparently, many voters coming to view the Iraq conflict as an example of deeper problems within the Republican Party. In the 2006 midterm elections, Democrats picked up 30 seats in the House, which gave them a majority in that chamber. The total popular vote for Democratic representatives exceeded the Republican vote by 6.4%. Democrats also picked up 6 seats in the Senate, giving them a 1-vote majority. By 2007 and 2008, half or more of those polled claimed to either to be Democrats or independents leaning Democratic, compared with about 40% on the Republican side. Bush's approval ratings were among the lowest ever recorded for president. Polls even suggested that voters were becoming more liberal on issues that had nothing to do with Iraq, such as support for anti-poverty measures, gay marriage. This Democratic trend was reinforced by bad economic news. By late 2007, the housing market collapsed. Homeowners were having trouble paying their mortgages, which set off a financial contagion that brought down several major institutions in 2008. When Lehman Brothers failed on September 15th, followed by Washington Mutual, it was clear that the country was on the brink of an economic collapse that would guarantee a Democratic victory in the 2008 elections. But then, just as it seemed as Republicans were on their last breath, Democrats, in their majority, overreached, passing a huge stimulus bill of over $1 trillion and passing a massive, sweeping health care bill known as the Affordable Care Act, without any compromise from the minority party. It put 20% of the U.S. economy under the federal government's control. The electorate began to get nervous about federal debt and the size of the federal government. In the 2010 midterm elections, Republican candidates stormed back and took a majority they have yet to give back. What we can learn from this is that regardless of your majority, a political party must be careful not to overreach its mandate. It's sometimes said that the major American political parties are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the twins in Lewis Carroll's famous book, Through the Looking Glass. Labels such as Republicrats are especially popular among the supporters of the third parties, such as the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. But third-party advocates, of course, have an interest in claiming that there's no difference between the two major parties, as their chances of gaining some support are better if they can cast the two parties as indistinguishable. Despite such allegations, the major parties do have substantial differences, both in their policies and in their constituents. Now, we learned the very first week that democratic factors affect support for the two major parties. Democrats receive disproportional support, not only from the least well-educated voters, but also from individuals with advanced degrees. Upper-income voters are generally more Republican than lower-income voters. Business persons are more likely to vote Republican, and labor union members are more likely to vote Democratic. The Jewish electorate is much more heavily Democratic. White evangelical Christians who are regular churchgoers tend to be Republicans. Hispanics are strongly Democratic. African Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic. Women are somewhat more Democratic than men. City dwellers tend to be Democrats. Rural people tend to be Republicans. In presidential elections, the South, Rocky Mountain states, Great Plains tend to vote more Republican. West Coast, Northeast tend to favor Democrats. These tendencies represent the influences of economic interests, cultural values, and of course they're often in conflict with each other. A coalition of the labor movement and various racial and ethnic minorities has been at the core of the Democratic Party since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. Social programs, increased government intervention in the economy that made Roosevelt's New Deal was intended to ease the pressure of economic hard times on these groups. This goal remains important for many Democrats today. In general, Democratic identifiers are more likely to approve social welfare spending, to support government regulation of business, to endorse measures to improve the situation of minorities, and to support assisting the elderly with their medical expenses. Republicans are more supportive of the private marketplace, believe more strongly in a theory of self-reliance and limited government. These traditional party beliefs are often reflected in public opinion polls. For example, in a recent New York Times CBS poll, respondents considered the Democrats more trustworthy than Republicans on economic and healthcare issues, although I have to be honest, that poll was taken on back in 2010, so it's really not very recent. In past years, polls have ranked Republicans as the stronger party on national security issues. Since the terrorist attacks of 2001, when national security interests became paramount, Republicans have been able to take advantage of this preference in their campaigns, until fairly recently when Democrats have closed that gap somewhat. Today, voters are much more evenly divided in their opinions of which party can better handle security and defense. Indeed, some recent polls even indicate that Democrats are currently stronger than Republicans in some of these areas, so it really kind of depends on the candidate. In his 1996 State of the Union address, Democratic President Bill Clinton announced that the era of big government is over. He lied. One might conclude from this that now both parties now favor limited government. And some political observers, however, argue that despite tax cuts Republicans have implemented, both parties in practice actually now favor big government. Harvard professor Jeffrey Frankel even goes further than that. He argues, quote, when it comes to White House economic policy, Frankel argues the Republican and Democratic parties have switched places since the 1960s, end quote. Frankel points out that budget deficits rose during the administrations of Republicans Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, but fell under Bill Clinton. Federal employment grew under Reagan and Bush, but fell under Clinton. Reagan and Bush both introduced protectionist measures meant to restrict imports, such as Bush's tariffs on imported steel and timber. But Clinton, despite the protectionist beliefs of many Democrats in Congress, was much more supportive of free trade, hence the fact that he pushed through NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Other observers have noticed a similar reversal in traditional party roles with respect to spending. Consider that Reagan, who faced a Congress controlled by Democrats, regularly submitted budgets submitted budgets to Congress that ended up and to a Democratic Congress that ended up being larger than the ones that they actually passed. But Clinton, however, who faced the Republican Congress for most of his administration, submitted budgets that were typically smaller than those that were actually approved by the Congress. During the presidency of George W. Bush, spending skyrocketed in part due to the Iraq War. Bush signed into law more domestic government spending increases than any president since World War II, even correcting for inflation, until the current president. By the time he left office in January of 2009, the federal budget deficit had hit a record, but that record has been shattered even further. It's been doubled since then by that of President Barack Obama to almost $18 trillion. In recent years, cultural values may have become more important than they were previously in defining the beliefs of the two major parties. For example, in 1987, Democrats were almost as likely to favor stricter abortion laws as Republicans were, 40 to 48%. Today, Republicans are twice as likely to favor stricter abortion laws, 50 to 25%. Thomas Frank, writing in Harper's Magazine, reported seeing the following bumper sticker at a gun show in Kansas City. Quote, a working person voting for the Democrats is like a chicken voting for Colonel Sanders. In case you don't know who Colonel Sanders is, he's the iconic founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, you know, the chain of fried chicken places. Now, in the light of economic traditions of the two parties, this seems to be kind of an odd statement. In fact, the sticker is an inexact reversal of an earlier one that was directed against Republicans. Now, you can make sense of such a sentiment by remembering what you learned last week. Although economic conservatism is associated with higher incomes, social conservatism is relatively more common among lower income groups. That individual who displayed the bumper sticker, therefore, was in effect claiming that cultural concerns, in this example, presumably the right to bear arms, are far more important than economic ones. But Frank argues that despite Republican control of both the White House and Congress during much of the George W. Bush administration, cultural conservatives continue to view themselves as under siege and in the battle, under threat from liberals and this cosmopolitan elite. Also, according to Republican commentator Carl Zinmeister, many police officers, construction workers, military veterans, and rural residents began moving toward the Republican Party in the 1960s and 1970s. In contrast, many of America's rich and super rich elite, including financiers, media barons, software millionaires, and entertainers, started slowly but surely drifting toward the Democratic Party. As a result, it's kind of difficult today to stereotype what socioeconomic groups support which political party. It's getting more and more confusing. Conventionally, some parts of the country are viewed as culturally liberal and others as culturally conservative. On a regional basis, cultural liberalism, as opposed to economic liberalism, may be associated with economic dynamism. The San Francisco Bay Area can serve as an example for us. The greater San Francisco Bay Area contains Silicon Valley, the heart of the microcomputer industry. It has the highest per capita personal income of any metropolitan area in the United States, but it is also the most liberal region of the country. San Francisco liberalism is largely culture-based. It's one sign that that this is the most liberal area, is that San Francisco claims to be the gay capital of America. To further illustrate this point, I guess I can compare the political differences of relatively wealthy states with relatively poor ones. So let me throw some data out at you. 15 states with the highest per capita personal incomes in 2008, 14 voted for Barack Obama in the presidential elections that year. Of the 15 states with the lowest per capita income, 13 of them voted for Republican John McCain. So it goes to show you that economic concerns not as important as the social concerns. Now, given this data, it's just really hard to believe that upper income voters really are more Republican than lower income ones. But still, within each state or region, upscale voters are more likely to be Republican, regardless of whether that area as a whole leans Democratic or Republican. States that vote Democratic are often northern states that contain large cities. At least part of this is called the reverse income effect. And it may simply be that urban areas are more prosperous, they have a more of a liberal Democratic in the countryside, and that the north is more prosperous, cultural Democratic than the south. Let's look at some cultural divisions between the two parties. So we'll go to this extremely close and hard-fought Democratic presidential primary contest between then Senator Obama and then Senator Clinton. And it exposed a series of cultural divisions within the Democratic Party that political scientists have been aware of for some time. If you really want to see some funny stuff, look at some of the recaps between the debates between then Senator Obama and then Senator Clinton. They really played some hardball with each other. Of course, African Americans supported Obama very strongly, and women tended to favor Clinton. But beyond these obvious patterns, Clinton appeared to do very well with older people, white working class voters, and Latinos, while Obama received much more support from younger and better educated upscale Democrats. Now, this division appeared to be similar to the cultural divisions in the general population that we just kind of discussed. But yet the differences between the two candidates on policy issues were actually just very small. Likewise, there was no evidence that Obama fans and Clinton backers had significantly different positions on the issues. The two groups may have been somewhat different kinds of people, but they appeared to have very similar policies and politics. One difference was the relative importance the two groups placed on certain issues. Older working class Clinton supporters were more concerned with economic issues, while the younger, more prosperous Obama supporters gave somewhat greater weight to issues like the war in Iraq and social issues. But the far greater difference was that the Clinton voters thought that she had the right experience, whereas the Obama supporters thought that he could bring about change, that she was part of the problem and he was part of the solution. To a degree, Obama's narrow victory reflects change in the Democrats' core constituencies. Traditionally, the candidate with a stronger working class appeal could expect to win over the largest number of Democrats. But as we've noted, professional individuals have shifted to the Democrats more, even as voters without college degrees have grown more Republican. So by 2008, Obama's upscale supporters made a larger share of the Democratic Party than they had in years past. So this is a shift. But still, Obama could not have won without strong support from African Americans of every class. So indeed, Obama's black support group was absolutely necessary to him. And apparently many African Americans saw very harsh criticisms that he received during the campaign as an attack on the black community as a whole. All right, so how about on the Republican side? Now, one wing of the Republican Party, often called the religious right, is energized by conservative religious beliefs. These conservatives are often evangelical Protestants, but they may be Catholics or Mormons or people of other faiths. For these voters, moral issues such as abortion or gay marriage are what activates them. The other wing of the Republican Party is more oriented toward economic and business concerns. These voters are often small business owners or have some connection to commercial enterprises. These voters oppose tax hikes and are concerned about government regulations that interfere with their business opportunities. In the current political environment, the differences among Republicans may have greater policy implications, though, than the divisions among Democrats. Of course, most Republicans are pro-business, and they also support the religious right, but some economically oriented Republicans have become very strongly libertarian, and they dislike this idea of government regulation of social issues as well as economic ones. So likewise, some on the religious right are not particularly committed to the free market place of the party's platform and are willing to support a variety of government interventions on the economy. So successful Republican candidates such as George W. Bush have tried to appeal to both wings of those parties. But yet people like John McCain and Mitt Romney both found it hard to appeal to the religious right wing of the party. McCain's maverick positions on a number of issues led many to doubt whether he was conservative enough for the party. I mean, they were idiots, but it was what it was. In the end, he was able to unite his party behind him, but not enough to win the election. Romney's membership in the Mormon Church made many on the religious right skeptical of his faith. In the end, though, he was also able to get the party to unite behind him, but again, not enough to defeat President Obama. Okay, so that's some divisions about the party. So let's kind of look at the faces of the party and some of its internal structures and so forth. I need to get a drink here. Take a break for a second. You can hit pause, I can't. All right, so although American parties are known by a single main idea, which is win elections, and they have a fairly common historical identity, each party really has three main parts. They have the party in the electorate, right, and that refers to all of the individuals that claim an attachment to the political party. They don't need to participate in an election campaign. Rather, the party in the electorate is the large number of Americans who feel some sort of loyalty to the party or who use partisanship as a cue to decide who's going to earn their vote. Party membership is not really a rational choice all the time. Rather, it's kind of an emotional tie, somewhat equal to identifying with the region of a nation or a baseball team or a football team, one of those kind of things. Although individuals may hold a very deep loyalty or identification with a political party, there's no real need for members of that party in the electorate to speak out publicly, to contribute to campaigns, or to vote all Republican or all Democratic. Needless to say, party leaders pay very close attention to the members in the electorate, but often they're the silent members. The second component, the party organization, provides the framework for the political party by recruiting volunteers to become party leaders, identifying political candidates, and organizing political caucuses, conventions, and election campaigns for its candidates. It's the party organization and its active workers that keep the party functioning. It ensures that the party puts forth electable candidates, clear positions, and if the party's electorate declines in number, it's the party organization that must find a strategy to keep its grassroots building and to really come up with a viable strategy to rebuild itself. The party and government is the third component of the American political party machine. And the party and government consists of those elected and appointed officials who identify with a political party. Generally, elected officials do not hold official party positions within the formal organization, although they often have informal power to appoint party executives. So they do have some power, but they don't hold a position in the party. So each of the American political parties is often seen as a pure-shaped organization with the national chairperson and committee at the top and the local precinct chairperson at the bottom. This structure, though, it doesn't really accurately reflect the relative power of the individual components. So that's why I'm not going to give you any kind of diagram on it, because it's really not accurate. If it did, then the national chairperson of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, along with the committee, could simply dictate to the whole organization how they're going to be run, like the CEO of ExxonMobil or Ford Motor Company does. In reality, political parties have a very loose confederal structure in which a unit has significant autonomy and is linked only loosely to the other units. They don't really have a lot of control over state and local parties. Now, the national party organization is kind of something like this. Each party has a national organization, the most clearly institutional part of which is the National Convention, which is held every 4 years. The convention is used to nominate the presidential and vice presidential candidates, and the party platform is also adopted at the National Convention. The platform stands for the party's position on the issues and makes promises to initiate certain policies if the party wins the presidency or positions in government. After the convention, the platform frequently is neglected or ignored by party candidates who actually disagreed with parts of it. Because candidates are trying to win votes from a wide spectrum of voters, it's fairly counterproductive to emphasize the fairly narrow and sometimes controversial goals that we're going to set forth in the platform. Political scientist Gerald M. Pomper discovered decades ago, however, that once elected, the political parties do try to carry out party platform promises, and then roughly about 3/4 of those promises will eventually become law. Of course, some general goals such as economic prosperity are included in the platform of both parties. They just word them a little different. The party convention provides the most striking illustration of the difference between the ordinary numbers of a party and party identifiers and party activists. As a series of studies by the New York Times shows, delegates to the national party conventions are different from ordinary party identifiers. Delegates to the National Convention, to the Democratic National Convention, take stands on many issues that are far more liberal than the positions of ordinary Democratic voters. Typically, delegates to the Republican National Convention are far more conservative than ordinary Republicans. Why does this happen? Well, in part, it's because a person who cares enough to vote in a primary or get appointed to a convention typically has a stronger viewpoint than the average voter. Also, primaries generally pick presidential candidates against each other on intra-party issues. Competition within each party tends to pull candidates away from the center, and delegates even more so. So often the most important activity for the convention is to make peace among the delegates who support different candidates. We got to pull them all together and get them behind whoever's going to be the presidential nominee. And we got to get them to accept a national platform that's going to appeal to the greatest number of people. Because again, remember, as a political party, we want to win elections. At the national convention, each of the parties formally chooses a national standing committee, elected by individual state parties. This national committee directs and coordinates the party activities for the following 4 years. Democrats include at least 2 members, a man and a woman from each state, from the District of Columbia, and from all U.S. territories. Governors, members of Congress, and other officials may be included as at-large members of the National Committee. Republicans, in addition, include state chairpersons from every state carried by the Republican Party in the preceding presidential, gubernatorial, or congressional elections. The selections of National Committee members are ratified by the delegates to the National Convention. One of the jobs of the national committees is to ratify the presidential nominee's choice of a national chairperson, who in principle acts as the spokesperson for the party. The national chairperson and the national committee then plan the next campaign and the next convention. They obtain financial contributions, they publicize the party, and they work on the brand. In general, the party's presidential candidate chooses the national chairperson. If that candidate loses, however, the chairperson is also often blamed for that loss, and they pretty much fire him and find somebody else. The national chairperson performs such jobs as establishing a national party headquarters, raising campaign funds, distributing them to state parties, to candidates, appearing in the media as a party spokesperson. And the national chairperson, along with the national committee, attempts to maintain some sort of liaison among the different levels of the party organization. In fact, though, the real strength of the 2 political parties is at the state level. So let's look at that. There are 50 states in the Union, plus District of Columbia, plus all the territories, and there are an equal number of party organizations for each major party in each state. Therefore, there are more than 100 state parties, and even more if we include all the local parties and all the minor parties. Because every state party is unique, I can't really describe each and every one, or even an average of what a state political party is like. But nevertheless, state parties have several different organizational features in common. Every state party has a chairperson, a committee, and a number of local organizations. In theory, the role of the state central committee, the principal organizing structure of each political party, is similar to in each of the various states. The committee, usually composed of members who represent the different congressional districts, state legislative districts, and counties, have responsibility for carrying out the policy decisions of the party's state convention. But in some states, the state committee can also issue directives to the state chairperson and tell him, you will do this. But also, like the national committee, the state central committee has control over the use of party campaign funds during political campaigns, so they can run ads and they can buy materials for candidates. Usually the state central committee has little, if any, influence on party candidates once they are elected. So in fact, state parties are fundamentally just a loose alliance of local interests and coalition of often bitterly opposed factions. They don't always like each other. State parties are also important in presidential politics because of the unit rule, which awards state electoral votes in presidential elections as an indivisible block, except in the states of Maine and Nebraska. Presidential candidates concentrate their efforts in which voter preference systems that seem to be evenly divided, or in which large numbers of electoral votes are at stake. Right. What about local parties? The lowest layer of party machinery is in the local organization, supported by district leaders, precinct or ward captains, and party workers. Much of the work is coordinated by county committees and by their chairpersons. Now, in the 1800s, the institution of patronage, and that's rewarding the party faithful with a government job or a contract, held the local organization together. For immigrants and the poor, this political machine often furnished important services and protections. The big city machine was an example. Tammany Hall, where the or the Tammany Society, which dominated New York City government well into the 20th century, was perhaps the most notorious example of this political form. They would hand out food, and they would hand out jobs, and they would tell people where they could get assistance, and they would help them get assistance as long as you voted for them. Now, the last big local political machine to exercise substantial power was run by Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, who was an important figure in national Democratic politics. Daley, as mayor, ran the Chicago Democratic machine from 1955 until his death in 1976. Now, his son was mayor until 2012, but he never had the same kind of political machine that his father had. And today, the mayor of Chicago is former chief of staff under President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, who is not tied to that Daley machine. Now, political machines are now mostly dead because the functioning of providing social services and reaping the rewards of votes has really been taken over by state and national agencies. Now, this trend began in the 1930s when the social legislation of the New Deal established Social Security and unemployment insurance. Today, local party organizations have little or anything to do with deciding with who's eligible to receive these benefits. So local political organizations, whether localized in cities or in townships or at the county level, can still contribute a great deal, though, to an election campaign. These organizations are able to provide the foot soldiers of politics. They pass out literature and they get out the vote on election day, which could be the difference between winning an election and losing it. In many regions, local Democratic and Republican organizations still exercise a little bit of patronage, such as awarding a job in a courthouse or contract for street repair or some other kind of construction contract. But the constitutionality of awarding or not awarding a contract on the basis of political affiliation has been subject to challenge. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the firing or failing to hire an individual because of their political affiliation is an infringement of the employee's First Amendment right to free expression. Local party organizations are the most important vehicles for recruiting young adults into political work because political involvement at the local level offers activists many opportunities to gain experience. If you're interested in the field of politics, go to your local party and get involved. Now, how does party work in government? After the election is over, after all the winners are announced, the focus of the party shifts from getting out the vote to controlling the government. Party membership is going to play an important role in the day-to-day operations of Congress, with partisanship determining everything from office space to committee assignments to power on Capitol Hill. Former presidents, political parties furnish the pool of qualified applicants for appointments to run the government. Although it's fairly uncommon to do so, presidents can and occasionally do appoint executive personnel such as cabinet members from the opposition party. There are not as many of these appointed positions as presidents really like, and presidential power is also limited by the permanent bureaucracy of the people who work in the executive branch regardless of which party controls it. Judicial appointments often also offer a great opportunity to the winning party. For the most part, presidents are likely to appoint federal judges from their own party, and those individuals are going to serve for life. All of these party appointments suggest that the winning political party, whether at the national, state, or local level, has a great deal of control in the American system. The degree of control that the winning party can actually exercise, however, depends on a bunch of factors. At the national level, an important factor is whether the party controls the executive branch of government. If it does, the party leadership may be reluctant to exercise congressional checks on the president's powers. If Congress is cooperating in implementing legislation approved by the president in turn won't feel it necessary to veto anything. Certainly, this situation existed while Republicans controlled both the executive and the legislative branches of government between 2001 and 2006. It also existed while the Democrats controlled both the executive and the legislative branches between 2008 and 2010. The winning party has less control over the government when the government is divided A divided government is one in which the executive and legislative branches are controlled by different parties. After the 2006 elections, this was the situation facing Democrats in Congress. Democrats were largely unable to pass any legislation that didn't meet with President Bush's approval because they didn't have sufficient votes. A two-thirds majority is needed to override a presidential veto. Although Bush exercised only one veto from 2001 to 2006, after the Democrats took control of Congress in January of 2007, he vetoed 11 bills. There are other ways in which power of parties is limited. Consider how major laws are passed in Congress. Traditionally, legislation has rarely been passed by a vote strictly along party lines. Although most Democrats may oppose a bill, for example, some Democrats may cross over and vote for it. Their votes, combined with the votes of Republicans, may be enough to pass the bill. Similarly, support from some Republicans may enable a bill sponsored by Democrats to pass. One reason that political parties have traditionally found it hard to rally all their members in Congress to vote along party lines is that candidates need to win most elections largely on their own, without significant help from the political party. A candidate generally gains a nomination for his own hard work and political organization. In most other countries, especially in European countries, most candidates are selected by the party organization, not by primary elections. This means, though, that in the United States, the party has very little control over the candidates who run under their own label. In fact, a candidate could run as a Republican, for example, and advocate positions that are completely repugnant to the national party, such as being a racist. But no one in the Republican Party organization could stop this person from being nominated or even being elected and being labeled a Republican. Now, despite the forces that act against the party line voting, there have been times when the two parties in Congress have been polarized and defections from the party line have been rare. Indeed, when the Republicans controlled Congress from 1994 through 2006, the party was able to achieve a great deal of unity and voted along party lines quite often. A notable example of such partisan voting control occurred in the House of Representatives in 1998. The issue at hand here was whether to impeach President Bill Clinton. Almost all of the votes during the course of the proceedings were strictly along party lines, Democrats against and Republicans for. This polarization in Congress has continued up to today. To be sure, after the Democrats controlled Congress in January of 2007, Republicans cast party line votes as some members sought to distance themselves from the unpopularity of the Bush administration. Democrats, however, responded to their new dominant position with a greater deal of unity than they had ever shown. So the question I have for you is, are high degrees of partisanship good for America, or are they bad for America? Yeah, you decide. So why has this two-party system endured for so long? Well, there are several reasons why the two major parties have dominated the political landscape in the United States for almost 200 years. These reasons have to do with the historical foundations of the system, political socialization, practical considerations, the winner-take-all system, and state and federal laws. As we've seen many times in American history, there has been one preeminent issue or dispute that divides the nation politically. In the beginning, Americans were at odds over ratifying the Constitution. After the Constitution went into effect, the power of the federal government became a national issue. After the dispute over slavery divided the nation by section, North versus South. At times, for example, in the North, after the Civil War, cultural differences have been important, with advocates of government-sponsored morality, such as banning alcoholic beverages, pitting those for personal liberty against personal liberty, and so forth. During much of the 20th century, economic differences were preeminent. In the New Deal, Democrats became known as the party of the working class, while Republicans became known as the party of the middle and upper classes and commercial interests. When politics is based on an argument between two opposing points of view, advocates of each viewpoint can mobilize most effectively by forming a single unified party, and that results in a two-party system. When such a system has been in existence for almost 2 centuries, it becomes very difficult to imagine something else working or a different system being implemented. Now, given that the majority of Americans identified with one of the two major political parties, it's also not surprising to learn that most children at a fairly young age begin to think of themselves either as Democrats or Republicans. This generates a built-in mechanism to perpetuate the two-party system. Many politically oriented people aspire to work for social change, consider that the only realistic way that they're ever going to be successful is to do it either as a Republican or a Democrat. At virtually every level of government in the United States, the outcome of elections is based on the plurality or the winner-take-all principle. In a plurality system, the winner is the person who obtains the most votes, even if that person doesn't receive a majority of the votes. Whoever gets the most votes gets everything. Most legislatures in the United States are elected from single-member districts in which only one person represents the constituency, and the candidate who finishes second in that election, he gets nothing, not even a set of Ginsu knives for their effort. The winner-take-all system also operates in the election of the U.S. president. Now, remember here that the voters in that state didn't vote for the president directly. They voted for electoral college delegates who are committed to the various presidential candidates. Those delegates are called electors. But in all but two states, Maine and Nebraska, if a presidential candidate wins a plurality in the state, then all of those electoral votes go to that candidate. For example, let us say that the electors were pledged to a presidential candidate that received a plurality of 40% of the votes in the state. That presidential candidate, though, will receive all of the state's votes in that electoral college, even though they didn't win a majority of the votes. Now, minor parties have a very difficult time competing under such a system, because voters know that minor parties can't win and if they can't win any electoral votes, they'll never win the election. So therefore, they won't often vote for a minor party candidate, even if the candidate is more in tune with them ideologically. Now, in most European countries, the chief executive, who's normally called a prime minister, is elected by the parliament or the legislature. If the parliament contains 3 or more parties, and that's almost always certainly the situation, 2 or more of the parties can join together in a coalition to choose the prime minister and the other leaders of government. In the United States, however, the 2 elected president and the governors of all 50 states are not elected that way. There's no opportunity for 2 or more parties to negotiate a coalition because there's only 2 parties. Here, too, the winner-take-all principle discriminates powerfully against any third party. Many other nations use a system of proportional representation with multi-member districts. If during a national election, political party obtains 12% of the vote, and party Y gets 43% of the vote, party Z gets the remaining 45% of the vote, then party A would get 12% of the seats in the legislature, party Y would get 43% of the seats in the legislature, and party Z would get 45% of the seats in the legislature. Because even a minor party may still obtain at least a few seats in the legislature, the smaller parties have a greater incentive to organize under such electoral systems than they do in the United States. The relative effect of a proportional representation system versus our system of single-member districts is so strong that many scholars have made them one of the very few laws of political science. Duverger's law, named after French political scientist Maurice Duverger, states that electoral systems based on single-member districts tend to produce 2-party systems, while systems with proportional representation produce multi-party systems. Still, many countries with single-member districts do have more than 2 political parties. Britain and Canada are examples, so it is possible. But there's one more factor that Britain and Canada don't have. Many state and federal election laws offer clear advantage to the 2 major parties. In some states, the major parties need to gather fewer signatures to place their candidates on the ballots, and minor parties need to jump through a few more flaming hoops than either Republicans or Democrats do. Now, the criteria for determining how many signatures will be required is often based upon the total party vote in the last general election, thus penalizing a new party that didn't compete in that election. At the national level, minor parties face different obstacles. All of the rules and procedures of both houses of Congress divide committee seats, staff members, and privileges based on party membership. A legislator who is elected on a minor party ticket, such as the Conservative Party of New York, must choose to be counted with one of the major parties in order to obtain a committee assignment. The Federal Election Commission rules for campaign finance to place restrictions on minor party candidates. Such candidates are not eligible for federal matching funds in either the primary or the general election. In the 1980 elections, John Anderson, running for president as an independent, sued the Federal Election Commission for campaign funds. The commission finally agreed to repay part of his campaign costs, but only after the election in proportion to the votes that he received. But getting that money afterwards was really pretty much less helpful than providing those funds while the campaign was still going. Thanks for nothing. Okay, so what role do these minor parties play? Well, for the reasons I just discussed, minor parties do have a very difficult, if not impossible, time competing with the American two-party political system. So why bother? Well, nevertheless, minor parties have played an important role in our political life. Parties other than the Republicans and Democrats are usually called third parties. Technically, of course, there could be fourth, fifth, or sixth parties, but we'll use the term third party because it's stuck around for a while and it's kind of endured. Third parties can come into existence in a number of ways. They can be formed by scratch by individuals or groups who are committed to a particular interest or issue or ideology. They can split off from one of the major parties when a group becomes dissatisfied with the major party's politics. Finally, they can be organized around a particular charismatic leader and serve as that person's vehicle for contesting in elections. Third parties have acted as barometers of change in the politics of the day. Such barometric indicators have forced the major parties to recognize new issues and trends in thinking of Americans. Political scientists believe that third parties have acted as safety valves for dissident groups, preventing major confrontations and political unrest. And in some instances, third parties have functioned as way stations for voters who are thinking about changing from one party to another. Let's think about the first one, which is ideological third parties. Now, these are the longest-lived third parties, and they have people who are in them have strong ideological foundations that are typically at odds with the majority mindset. The Socialist Party is an example. That party was founded in 1901 and lasted until 1972 when it was finally dissolved. But a smaller American Socialist Party took up the name later, so yes, it's still around today. Ideology has at least two functions. First, the members of the minor party regard themselves as outsiders, and they look to one another for support. Ideology provides great psychological cohesiveness. And second, because the rewards of ideological commitment are partially psychological, these minor parties do not think of themselves in immediate electoral success. They know a poor showing at the polls doesn't disappoint them or dissuade them from participating in their quest for change in American government and ultimately in American society. Current active ideological parties include the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. The Libertarian Party supports a let-it-be capitalistic economic program together with a hands-off policy regarding moral conduct. The Green Party began as a grassroots environmentalist organization with affiliated political parties across North America and Western Europe. It was established in the United States as a national party in 1996, nominated Ralph Nader to run for president in 2000. Nader campaigned against what he called corporate greed, and he advocated for universal health insurance and promoted environmental concerns. He ran again for president as an independent in 2004 and 2008. Now, some of the most successful minor parties have been those that split from the major parties. The driving factor for splinter parties or factions has usually been a situation in which a particular personality was in odds with their major party that they used to be a member of. The most successful of these splinter parties was the Bull Moose Progressive Party, formed in 1912 to support Theodore Roosevelt for president. The Republican National Convention of that year denied Roosevelt the nomination, despite the fact that he had won most of the primaries. He therefore left the Republicans and ran against Republican regular William Howard Taft in the general election. Although Roosevelt didn't win the election, he did split the Republican vote, and he enabled the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to become president. Third parties have also been formed to back individual candidates who were not rebelling against a particular party, but against a particular idea. Ross Perot, for example, challenged Republican George H.W. Bush and Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992. He had never been previously active in a major party before that. Perot's supporters probably would have split their votes between Bush and Clinton had Perot not been in the race. In theory, Perot ran in 1992 as a non-party independent. In practice, he had to create a campaign organization from scratch. By 1996, Perot's organization was formalized as the Reform Party. Third parties have rarely been able to affect American politics, but actually have rarely been able to affect American politics, but have not actually been able to win very many elections. One exception to that is third party and independent candidates have actually won some races for state governorship. For example, was the election of Jesse Ventura for governor of Minnesota on the Reform Party ticket in 1998. Instead, the impact of third parties has taken two forms. First, third parties can influence one of the major parties to take up one or more issues. Second, third parties can determine the outcome of a particular election by pulling votes from one major party candidate in what's called a spoiler effect. Now, one of the most clear-cut examples of a major party adopting the issues of minor parties took place in 1896 when the Democratic Party took over the populist demand for free silver. That is, the policy of coining enough new money to create inflation. But as we talked about earlier in this video notes, absorbing the idea of free silver, the populist idea, cost the Democrats votes because it drove the working man into the arms of the Republicans who was concerned about his paycheck. The presidential elections of 2000 was another instance in which a minor party may have altered the outcome. Green Party candidate Ralph Nader received almost 100,000 votes in the state of Florida, a majority of which would probably have gone to Democrat Al Gore if Nader had not been in the race. The real question, however, is not whether Nader's vote had an effect. Clearly it did, but whether the effect was important. The problem is that in elections this close, as the election in 2000 was, any factor with an impact on the outcome can be said to have determined the results of the election. There's a famous quote here discovering when he discussed his landslide loss to Democrat Lyndon Johnson in 1964, Republican Barry Goldwater wrote, "When you've lost an election by that much, it isn't the case of whether you made the wrong speech or you wore the wrong necktie. It was just the wrong time." In the opposite situation, a humorist might speculate that Gore would have won the election had he worn a better tie. So maybe Gore just didn't do enough to win the election himself. Nevertheless, given that Nader garnered almost 3 million votes nationwide, many believe that the Nader campaign was an important reason for Gore's loss. So in the future, could one of the two parties decisively overtake the other and become the natural party of government, establishing a new modern era of political parties? Well, Republicans have held the status from 1896 to 1932. Democrats held it from 1932 to 1968. Could we get another set of era like that? Well, one mechanism by which a party might gain dominance is called realignment. In this process, major constituencies shift their allegiance from one party to another, creating a long-term alteration in the political environment. Realignment has often been associated with particular elections called realigning elections. The election of 1896, for example, which established a Republican ascendancy, was clearly a realigning election. So was the election of 1932, which made Democrats the leading party. A number of myths, though, exist about the concept of realignment. One is that in realignment, the dominant party must replace the previous dominant party. Actually, realignment could easily happen to an already dominant party and make them more dominant. Alternatively, realignment could happen over time. This has happened twice. One example was the realignment of the 1850s, which resulted in Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860. After the Civil War, the Republicans and Democrats were almost matched evenly. The most recent realignment, which also resulted in two closely matched parties, was a gradual process that took place over many years. In 1968, Republican President Nixon adopted a, quote, Southern strategy that was aimed at drawing dissatisfied Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. At the presidential level, the strategy was an immediate success, although it would take many years before the Republicans would gain dominance in the South's delegation to Congress in state legislatures. Another milestone in the progress of the Republican realignment was Ronald Reagan's sweeping victory in the presidential elections of 1980, and for the most part, Republicans have dominated the South ever since. In the sheer size of our nation, combined with the immense pressure of the two-party system, has resulted in parties made up of voters with conflicting interests or values. This system really could only survive, over time without change. I mean, it's going to change at certain times. There's going to be another realignment of election. We shouldn't be surprised that structures eventually collapse. The Republican ascendancy from 1896 to 1932 united capitalists and industrial workers under the Republican banner, even though there were serious conflicts between the two. The New Deal Democratic Coalition brought African Americans and ardent segregationists into the same party. So the next realignment election most likely will bring two foes together under the same party banner. That's not going to be surprising, and it's taken place many times. For realignment to occur, a substantial body of citizens must come to believe that their party can no longer represent their interests or values. The problem must be fundamental and not attributable to the behavior of an individual politician. Despite the divisions within the parties discussed, it's not easy to identify groups of Republicans or Democrats today, though, who might reach such a conclusion. It's something for us to think about. Among political scientists, though, one common argument is that realignment is no longer likely is because voters are not as committed to the two major parties as they used to be back in the 1800s and early 1900s. In this view, which is called de-alignment theory, large numbers of independent voters may result in political votility, but the absence of strong partisan attachments means that it's no longer easy to lock in their political preferences for decades. As we expand the number of people who claim to be independent, they lean one way or the other depending on the times. Trends in party identification, as measured by standing polling techniques from 1944 to the present, display a rise in the number of independent voters throughout this period, combined in a fall in support for the Democrats from the mid-1960s on. The decline in Democratic identification, mainly due to the consolidation of Republican support in the South since 1968, is a process that's now substantially complete. In any event, the traditional Democratic advantage in party ID has largely vanished. How has the growing number of independents affected recent election outcomes? So based upon what I've told you already, how do you think that the growing number of independents is affecting recent election outcomes? Not only has the number of independents grown over the last half century, but voters are also less willing to vote a straight line ticket, that is, to vote for all candidates of one party. In the early 1900s, straight line ticket voting was nearly universal. By the middle of the century, 12% of voters engaged in split ticket voting, voting for candidates of two or more parties for a different office, such as voting for a Republican presidential candidate and a Democrat congressional candidate. In recent presidential elections, though, between 20 to 40% of voters engaged in split-ticket voting. It's very hard to measure. This trend, along with increases in voters who call themselves independents, suggests that political parties have lost much of their hold on the voters' loyalty. Now, one problem with de-alignment theory is that many independent voters are not all that independent. For some time, about 1/3 of voters who classified themselves as independently typically voted Democrat, and another 1/3 voted Republican. The remaining third consisted of true independents and became known as swing voters. They could swing back and forth between the parties. Because of this, swing voters normally have been targeted by advertising campaigns by campaigns of both parties. They are the people who decide elections. The preferences of independent voters, though, have changed significantly in the last few years. Democratic gains have come largely from independents, about 2/3 who now lean Democratic. Polls reveal that if the partisans and leaders among the independents are combined, the Democrats enjoy a significant advantage over the Republicans. At least 50% of voters identify with the Democratic Party and 40% with the Republican Party. These figures fluctuate somewhere from month to month, week to week, day to day, responding to the shifting winds of public opinion. Don't forget that fluctuations also occur because of the margin of error that's built into the public opinion polls that I talked about in the last set of video notes. Now, political transformation can also result from changes in the composition of the electorate. Even when groups of voters never change their party preferences, if one group becomes more numerous over time, it can become dominant for that reason alone. We call this kind of demographic changing tipping. Now consider the state of Massachusetts, where 4 generations of Irish Catholics confronted Protestant Yankees in the political arena. Most of these Yankees were Republicans. Most of the Irish were Democrats. The Yankees were numerically dominant from the founding of the state until 1928. In that year, for the first time, Democratic Irish came to outnumber the Republican Yankees. Massachusetts, which previously had been one of the most reliably Republican states in the Union, all of a sudden became one of the most reliably Democratic states in the nation, and has remained so ever since. California may have experienced a tipping effect during the 1990s. From 1952 through 1988, California normally supported Republican presidential candidates. But since 1992, no Republican presidential candidate has managed to carry California. The improved performance of Democrats in California is almost certainly a function of its demographics now. In 1999, California became the 3rd state after Hawaii and New Mexico in which non-Hispanic whites did not make up a majority of the population. Is it possible that states other than California may tip to a different party in future years? Well, in 2002, John Judis and Ray Teixeira argued that the Democrats were poised to become the new majority party due to a growth in the number of liberal professions and Hispanic immigrants. This piece attracted much ridicule in subsequent years as the Republicans continued to triumph in midterm and presidential elections. But by 2008, the thesis had gained a lot more credibility. A growing Hispanic vote was clearly pushing several southwestern states such as Nevada and Colorado into the Democratic column, while a large number of upscale urban voters in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. brought an end to the traditional Republican dominance in Virginia. Are we seeing tipping in Virginia today? A very good question that I'll leave you with, and I'll let you, for 5 points, post to me whether you think we're seeing tipping in Virginia today. You can send it to me via email, and this ends my notes on political parties. Good luck. If you have any questions, bring them to class. Let me know. This is Mr. L signing off on political parties. Thanks for listening.